Evelyn Carter had finally moved into the house she had dreamed of for years, her personal reward for decades of hard work and sacrifice. A two-story cottage with white walls and a wide veranda stood in the center of a well-kept yard, surrounded by a tall wooden fence that was meant to provide her with privacy and peace. Around it stretched a garden with neatly arranged flower beds, carefully planned even before the move, with dozens of landscaping ideas running through her mind. Everything was supposed to be perfect. In the backyard, a crystal-clear swimming pool reflected the sunlight, shimmering invitingly, a symbol of the serenity she longed for. This was her sanctuary, her well-earned rest after a lifetime of work. She had chosen this neighborhood for a reason. She wanted peace, a quiet place to enjoy her golden years, tending to her flowers, reading in the shade, sipping tea on the veranda while the wind rustled the leaves. After her husband's passing, their old home had become too heavy with memories, and this house represented a fresh start, a chance to live without sadness, just harmony and quiet. She pictured herself stepping out every morning with a cup of coffee, feeling the warm sun on her skin, breathing in the scent of freshly bloomed jasmine, listening to the stillness of the world around her. But that stillness didn't last long. On the very first day after moving in, she noticed children running across her lawn. They stomped on the fresh flower beds, leaving broken stems and trampled petals behind. Their laughter rang out as they chased each other, completely unaware of her presence. Evelyn wasn't the type to immediately turn into a strict old neighbor, but when one boy yanked a young rose bush out of the soil and waved it triumphantly in the air, her chest tightened. She stepped onto the porch, raising her voice just enough to be heard over their shouting, telling them firmly but calmly that her garden was not a playground. The children hesitated for a second, exchanged glances, and then ran off, laughing as if nothing had happened. A few hours later, another problem surfaced. As she walked through her backyard, a sound caught her attention, a splash. Her heart clenched at the thought, and she quickened her pace toward the pool. There, a boy around 12 was happily swimming, while a younger girl dangled her feet in the water. Evelyn froze for a moment, staring in disbelief. They were acting as if they owned the place. She stepped closer, keeping her voice steady, and asked what they were doing in her yard. The boy clambered out of the pool, his eyes wide with surprise, while the girl mumbled something about living 2 houses down and thinking it would be okay to take a quick dip since the water looked so nice. That evening, she decided to talk to their parents, believing it was just a misunderstanding that could be resolved with a simple conversation. But instead of apologies, she was met with dismissive smiles. When she explained that the pool was private property and that no one should be using it without permission, the boy's mother waved a hand as if brushing away an insignificant complaint. "You're an old woman, why do you even need a pool? Let the kids have some fun." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice controlled as she responded that she decided who was welcome in her home. The woman only rolled her eyes and scoffed, "You're taking this way too seriously. Around here, we share." As Evelyn turned to leave, another woman approached her, a tall, well-groomed blonde with a practiced smile. She extended her hand and introduced herself, "Sandra Martin. I live 3 houses down. We all know each other here, we help each other out. You're new, it's better to be friendly." Evelyn recognized the subtle warning beneath her words. She shook Sandra's hand but said nothing. She already knew, her attempts to set boundaries and simply enjoy her home would not be so easy. The next morning, as Evelyn Carter stepped onto her porch with a cup of hot tea, something immediately felt wrong. Dark, wet footprints trailed across the stone tiles surrounding her pool, an erratic pattern leading from the water's edge to the gate, as if someone had hurriedly left. Her brows furrowed as she walked closer, her heart already pounding with unease. Draped over a lounge chair was a soaked towel, not hers, carelessly abandoned like an afterthought. A half-empty plastic soda bottle rested on the pool's edge, faint lip marks staining the rim. A slow realization crept over her. Someone had been here, again, using her pool as if it belonged to them, as if her home were nothing more than a public space. She clenched her jaw, picked up the damp towel between her fingers, then tossed it aside with disgust. Anger curled inside her, tight and cold. Determined to get answers, she made her way to the nearest house, the one where she suspected the kids who had trampled her lawn earlier lived. Knocking firmly on the door, she waited, bracing herself for an apology, for some kind of understanding. Instead, when the door swung open, a woman about her age greeted her with a relaxed smile, as if they were old friends having a casual conversation. Evelyn wasted no time. "Were your children in my pool yesterday?" she asked, her voice even but firm. The woman blinked, looking neither guilty nor particularly surprised. Instead, she shrugged, her lips curling into an amused smirk. "Maybe? What does it matter?" Evelyn felt her patience thin. "It matters because my pool is private property. Your children entered my yard without permission." What she heard next nearly knocked the breath out of her. The woman tilted her head, laughing lightly, as if Evelyn had just said something ridiculous. "You live alone, so what's the big deal?" For a moment, Evelyn just stared, struggling to process the sheer audacity of the words. It wasn't just about the children anymore. It was about the blatant disregard for her boundaries, the assumption that because she was an elderly woman, her rights mattered less. Before she could respond, the woman added with a chuckle, "Besides, you don't really use the pool, do you? It's hard for you to get down those steps, isn't it? It's convenient for us." Something inside Evelyn went still. She inhaled slowly, trying to steady herself against the insult hidden in those words. They didn't just see her as an easy target, they saw her as irrelevant, as someone whose presence was an inconvenience, whose home was nothing more than an opportunity for their own enjoyment. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her spine straight, her hands clenched at her sides. That same afternoon, she drove to the hardware store, selecting the strongest, most durable lock she could find. When she returned, she installed it herself, securing the gate leading to the pool. From now on, no one would enter without her permission. As she stepped back to admire her work, a sense of satisfaction settled in her chest. They would have to respect her now. But her relief was short-lived. That night, long after the sun had set and the neighborhood had fallen into silence, a noise stirred her from sleep. A dull, metallic scraping. She sat up in bed, pulse quickening, straining to listen. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate grind, followed by a faint clicking. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was someone outside. Evelyn slid out of bed, pulling on her robe, and made her way cautiously to the window. The street was dark and empty, nothing moving except the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows. But the feeling in her gut told her she wasn't alone. Grabbing a flashlight from the counter, she stepped quietly through the back door and aimed the beam toward the gate. Her stomach dropped. The new lock, the one she had installed only hours ago, hung uselessly, one hinge broken, pieces of shattered metal scattered across the ground. Someone had come, someone had forced their way in, and whoever it was had made sure she understood the message. This wasn't a careless accident. This was intentional. This was someone proving a point. Her breath came slow and controlled, but beneath it, anger burned hot. They wanted to remind her that she had no control here, that no matter what she did, they would not respect her space. They expected her to accept it, to roll over, to move aside, to let them take what they wanted. But as she stood there in the cold night air, staring at the broken lock, Evelyn knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Late at night, Evelyn Carter was startled awake by the unmistakable thump of bass vibrating through her bedroom walls. At first, she thought she was imagining it, that maybe the sound was just distant noise from someone's car driving by, but then came the unmistakable flashes of light dancing across her curtains, bright and erratic, pulsing in rhythm with the music. Her pulse quickened as she threw off her blanket and pushed herself up, already knowing, deep in her gut, that something was wrong. She slipped her feet into her slippers, grabbed her robe, and made her way toward the window, parting the curtains just enough to peer outside. Her backyard, which should have been dark and silent, was lit up like a nightclub, flooded with bright, shifting colors. The unmistakable flicker of phone screens moved like fireflies in the night, and the sound of laughter, shouting, and splashing water filled the air. Her throat tightened. Someone was having a party in her pool. With her heart hammering in her chest, she didn't even bother turning on the porch light as she stormed toward the back door, her fingers tightening around the doorknob before wrenching it open. The noise hit her like a tidal wave, dozens of voices overlapping, the smell of alcohol, chlorine, and sweat thick in the humid night air. Her carefully arranged patio furniture had been dragged into disarray, towels and beer bottles scattered across the deck. Someone had set up a folding table covered in snacks, and in her pool, half a dozen people were swimming, laughing, splashing like this was their personal resort. A speaker, much too large to have been carried in unnoticed, sat by the water's edge, blaring music so loudly she could feel it in her bones. Her vision tunneled with fury as she stepped forward, her voice sharp and cutting as she shouted, "What the hell is going on here?" The reaction was almost comical. Some of them froze, others turned slowly, like they were confused why she was upset at all. A young man, probably no older than 25, grinned at her from the edge of the pool, water dripping from his chin as he spread his arms wide. "Relax, lady, it's just a pool," he called out, amusement in his voice. "You're not even using it, so what's the big deal?" Evelyn felt her hands tremble, but not with fear, with barely restrained rage. She scanned the crowd, recognizing a few faces. Sandra Martin stood near the back, drink in hand, watching the whole thing unfold with an almost smug expression. Evelyn's jaw tightened as she marched toward the speaker, ripping the power cord from the socket, plunging the backyard into momentary silence. "Get." Her voice was low and firm, carrying more weight than the shouting ever could. "Every single one of you, out of my yard." Now, for a moment, no one moved. Then came the murmurs, the eye rolls, the scoffs, the unmistakable murmured complaints of "she's overreacting, it's just water, why is she so uptight?" Sandra took a slow sip of her drink before setting it down, shaking her head with exaggerated disappointment. "Oh, come on, Evelyn," she drawled, voice full of false sympathy. "We were just cooling off. No harm, no foul." Evelyn's hands clenched into fists. "This is MY home. You don't get to decide what I allow on MY property." The response was a mocking laugh from someone in the crowd, followed by another voice, more condescending this time. "Wow, didn't know we had a pool cop in the neighborhood. That was it." She turned on her heel, storming back into her house, grabbing her phone and dialing 911. The line rang twice before a dispatcher picked up, and she wasted no time explaining. "I have trespassers in my backyard. They broke into my property and are refusing to leave." 15 minutes later, the red and blue lights of a police car finally cut through the darkness, the music now completely off, the party subdued into a restless murmur. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions already laced with boredom, and Evelyn exhaled sharply, moving toward them. "They broke into my yard. I want them removed." The older officer glanced toward the crowd, then back at her, his expression unreadable before he sighed, his tone far too casual. "Look, ma'am, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. Maybe it's best if we just resolve this peacefully." Evelyn's mouth tightened. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated, her voice dangerously calm. "They trespassed. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a crime." The second officer, younger, shifted uncomfortably, scratching the back of his neck. "You know, elderly folks sometimes get worked up over nothing." Evelyn felt a surge of cold fury course through her veins. "Worked up," she echoed, the word tasting like acid in her mouth. Behind her, she could hear some of the partygoers chuckling under their breath, muttering things about how she was making a scene, about how she was ruining the fun. Sandra, ever the instigator, sighed dramatically and walked up to the officers with a practiced air of innocence. "We really didn't mean any harm," she said smoothly. "It was just a little get-together. I think Evelyn is just struggling to adjust to the way things work around here." Evelyn's stomach twisted with the implication, the veiled reminder that she didn't belong. The officer nodded slowly, clearly swayed by the casual charm of Sandra's words. "Maybe next time, just try talking to your neighbors first," he suggested, as if it were Evelyn who had overstepped, as if she had been the one to violate someone else's space. She swallowed the hot reply on her tongue, knowing that arguing would do nothing, knowing that these men wouldn't take her side. The party began to dissipate, but not because the police forced them to leave, because they wanted to. A slow, arrogant departure, people grabbing their drinks, rolling their eyes, smirking as they walked past her, unbothered, untouched by the consequences they should have faced. When the last person was gone, when the police had finally left, Evelyn stood alone in the wreckage of her own backyard, surrounded by discarded bottles, crushed chips, and damp towels left behind like forgotten remnants of a battle she had somehow lost. Her jaw clenched, her chest tight, but even through the anger, a realization settled over her like a weight. In their eyes, she wasn't the victim. She was the problem. Evelyn Carter woke up early, reaching for her phone to check the weather, but the first thing that caught her eye was a notification from the local community group. The post at the top of the feed, written in bold letters, belonged to Sandra Martin. The words made Evelyn's stomach churn before she even finished reading. Why do old people buy houses they don't need? The comments were already flooding in, a toxic mix of mockery and veiled contempt. Maybe she should move to a simpler neighborhood, one person wrote, their words sharp and casual, as if suggesting she was an inconvenience, as if she didn't belong. Another comment followed quickly, old people are so uptight. She's probably just bored and looking for something to complain about. More replies piled on, each one stripping away any illusion that this was just about a pool or a broken lock. Evelyn clenched the phone in her hand, a slow, burning heat crawling up her spine as she scrolled through the thread. They weren't just dismissing her. They wanted her gone. She wasn't even human to them, just a problem, an obstacle in the way of their entitlement. Her fingers hovered over the screen, an instinct to reply, to defend herself, to remind them that she had worked for this home, that she had earned the right to live here just as much as any of them. But what would it change? Nothing. She already knew how they saw her, and now they had made it clear, they weren't just going to ignore her, they were going to push her out. A knock at the door made her snap her head up, her pulse quickening. She took a breath, pushing away the anger, and moved toward the front entrance. When she opened it, no one was there. Instead, sitting on her doorstep, was a piece of folded paper, weighted down by a small rock. A deep, sick feeling settled in her stomach as she bent down, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked it up. The paper was rough, torn from a notebook, the edges frayed. When she unfolded it, four words glared up at her in thick, uneven handwriting. "You don't belong here." Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the letters, her chest tightening with something beyond anger, something colder, deeper. It wasn't just a joke. It wasn't just petty gossip. It was a message. A warning, a threat, an attempt to make her feel like a stranger in her own home. Tightening her grip on the note, she stepped outside, her eyes scanning the street. Everything looked normal. Cars parked in driveways, birds chirping in the distance, a sprinkler rhythmically clicking as it watered someone's lawn. But to Evelyn, it no longer felt like her neighborhood. It felt like enemy territory. She turned toward her yard, determined to shake off the unease, but when her gaze fell on her flower beds, the breath left her lungs. The once perfect rows of lilies and daisies were destroyed, petals ripped from stems, soil kicked up into messy mounds, footprints stamped deep into the dirt. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone had stood here, in the dead of night, tearing apart something she had nurtured with her own hands, and she knew exactly why. It was personal. For a long moment, she stood motionless, the paper still clutched tightly in her hand, her knuckles white. A slow, steady realization settled over her like ice. They weren't just disrespecting her. They weren't just ignoring her boundaries. They were trying to erase her presence, to force her into feeling so uncomfortable, so unwelcome, that she would do exactly what they wanted. But as she stood there, staring at the wreckage of her flowers, at the message scrawled in thick ink, at the street that now felt like a battlefield, she felt something shift inside her. A decision. A certainty. She wasn't going anywhere. They thought they could break her, scare her, push her out of her own home. But they had made a mistake. They had started a war. And Evelyn Carter had every intention of finishing it. Evelyn Carter had spent her entire life following the rules, believing that respect was earned through patience and dignity, but the destruction of her flower beds and the cruel message left at her doorstep had stripped away any illusions that reason would work here. These people didn't want to listen. They didn't want to compromise. They wanted to push her out, erase her presence, treat her home as if it was theirs to use and hers to abandon. But she wasn't leaving. If they wanted a battle, she was going to give them one. She spent the next morning making phone calls, arranging deliveries, planning every step with meticulous precision. By the afternoon, she was in her backyard, overseeing the first step of her counterattack. A new, reinforced fence, towering over the original, stretching high enough that no one could simply climb over it. She watched as the workers drilled and secured each wooden panel into place, every thud of the hammer like a declaration of defiance. When it was done, her property was no longer an open invitation, it was a fortress. But she wasn't finished. She installed surveillance cameras, not just at the entrances but angled toward every vulnerable point, ensuring that no one could step foot onto her land without being caught on film. She positioned motion-activated floodlights along the perimeter, set to illuminate anyone who dared to try. She was tired of shadows, tired of whispers, tired of feeling powerless in her own home. If they wanted to test her boundaries now, they would do it under the brightest possible spotlight. The finishing touch came in the form of a large, metal sign, drilled firmly into the gate, its bold, black letters impossible to ignore. Private property. Trespassing will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. It wasn't just a warning, it was a statement. The days of playing nice were over. She didn't have to wait long for the backlash. By that evening, her phone lit up with notifications from the same neighborhood group that had mocked her before. Sandra Martin's name was at the top of yet another thread, stirring the pot with a sickening ease. "Imagine being so miserable that you build a prison around yourself," she wrote, her words dripping with false sympathy. The comments beneath were exactly what Evelyn expected. "What an unfriendly old bat," one person wrote. "She doesn't even have family visiting. Who is she trying to keep out?" another added. One particularly infuriating comment read, "If she hates the community so much, maybe she should just leave." Evelyn scrolled through the flood of complaints, her jaw tightening, but instead of frustration, something colder settled inside her. They weren't upset because she was wrong. They were upset because she had stopped playing by their rules. They didn't like that she was resisting, that she had taken away their ability to walk all over her, that she had drawn a line they could no longer ignore. They wanted her to feel isolated, unwanted, defeated. But they had underestimated her. If the rules didn't work, it was time to make new ones. Evelyn Carter sat at her kitchen table, staring at the screen of her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she carefully reviewed the details of her latest plan. She had spent weeks trying to reason with these people, trying to set boundaries with words, with fences, with security measures that any decent person would respect. But decency wasn't something they cared about. They saw her kindness as weakness, her patience as permission, her warnings as jokes. She had tried everything by the book, and they had laughed in her face. That was fine. She had one last lesson to teach them. The product was easy enough to find, a non-toxic chemical compound commonly used in public pools to discourage bad behavior. It was designed to react to bodily fluids, producing an unpleasant but harmless side effect, a temporary skin irritation, redness, and an intense itch. Perfectly safe, undetectable to the naked eye, but enough to make anyone who dared to step into her water regret it immediately. She placed the order, closed her laptop, and leaned back in her chair, feeling something she hadn't felt in weeks. Satisfaction. 2 days later, the package arrived, a plain white box with an unassuming label. She brought it inside, carefully followed the instructions, and poured the precise amount into her pool, watching as the water rippled and then settled, looking as pristine as ever. There was no strange color, no smell, nothing to indicate that anything had changed. But she knew. And soon so would they. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first shadows stretched across her backyard, Evelyn sat by her living room window, sipping tea, waiting. It didn't take long. 2 dark silhouettes appeared at the top of her newly built fence, their movements quick and practiced, as if they had done this 100 times before. Teenagers, probably the same ones who had been using her pool all along. One of them dropped down first, landing softly on the grass, while the other hesitated for just a second before following. They crept toward the water, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't need to. With barely a whisper, they slipped into the pool, the surface breaking around them in shimmering ripples. For a moment, there was silence, just the quiet lapping of water against the tiles, and then the first boy sighed in relief. "Damn, this is nice," he muttered, leaning back, floating effortlessly. The second chuckled, splashing at the water, completely oblivious to what was coming. And then it started. At first, it was subtle, a shift, a fidget, a quick scratch against an arm. But within seconds, it escalated. The first boy jerked upright, rubbing at his chest, his fingers moving faster, more frantic. The second swore under his breath, twisting his shoulders as if something was crawling over him. "What the hell?" one of them hissed, scratching at his arms, his neck, his back, the irritation spreading like wildfire. The first boy was already kicking toward the edge, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "Dude, my skin is burning," he stammered, his voice rising. The second barely made it out before collapsing onto the deck, frantically clawing at his arms, red blotches already appearing on his skin. Evelyn took a slow sip of her tea, watching as pure panic set in. The boys scrambled to their feet, tripping over themselves as they bolted for the fence, one nearly falling flat on his face as he tried to climb up in blind desperation. The moment his hands reached the top, he vaulted over, disappearing into the night, the second one following so fast it was a miracle he didn't break an ankle. And then they were gone. By morning, the storm had already begun. The neighborhood group chat was in absolute chaos. "Do not let your kids swim in that woman's pool," one post read, the words in all caps, panic dripping from every sentence. Another followed minutes later, "Something in the water is causing a horrible reaction." Some claimed she had poured dangerous chemicals into the pool, others whispered about poison, lawsuits, retaliation. But the best one, the one that almost made Evelyn laugh, came from Sandra Martin herself. "She's officially gone too far. This is unacceptable. Someone like that doesn't belong in our neighborhood." Evelyn barely had time to finish reading before the furious pounding on her front door began. She exhaled slowly, set down her phone, and walked to the entrance, already knowing who it would be. When she swung the door open, Sandra stood on her porch, face red, eyes blazing with self-righteous fury. "Are you serious?" she snapped, pushing forward like she had any right to step inside. "This is already beyond ridiculous. You could have seriously hurt someone." Evelyn didn't flinch, didn't move, simply arched an eyebrow, letting Sandra dig her own grave. "Hurt someone," she repeated, voice as smooth as silk. "As far as I know, no one was supposed to be in my pool to begin with." Sandra scoffed, throwing her hands up. "Oh, don't play dumb. You know damn well what you did." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to watch the frustration build. "If my pool is such a problem for you," she said finally, her tone as calm as ever, "perhaps you should stay out of it." For a second, just a second, Sandra's mouth opened, then shut, then opened again, the weight of Evelyn's words sinking in. She had no argument, no defense, no way to twist it into Evelyn being the villain. And that realization was written all over her face. Evelyn smiled. And then, ever so gently, she closed the door. Evelyn Carter had expected retaliation, but when the letter arrived in the mail, stamped with the official seal of the neighborhood committee, she couldn't help but smirk as she tore it open. The wording was formal, almost excessively polite, but the message was clear. Her pool was now considered a potential hazard to the community, and she was required to provide proof that it met safety regulations within 30 days, or she would face fines and potential closure. There was no mention of trespassing, no acknowledgement of the vandalism, no reference to the fact that the only people who had suffered harm were the ones who had broken into her property in the first place. They had twisted the situation brilliantly, framing her as the reckless, irresponsible homeowner while they painted themselves as concerned citizens, just looking out for the neighborhood. She leaned back in her chair, running her fingers over the page, her lips curling at the irony. These were the same people who had laughed in her face when she complained about her privacy being violated, the same people who had dismissed her warnings as paranoia, the same people who had broken into her yard, trashed her property, and used her space like a public playground, and now they had the audacity to label her as the problem. That night, the attack became more direct. She had just finished washing the dinner dishes when she noticed something strange outside, the shadowed outline of something sticking out of the middle of her lawn. She stepped onto her porch, narrowing her eyes as she moved forward, the pit of her stomach twisting with unease. When she got close enough, she saw it, a sign planted firmly into the ground, the cheap plastic gleaming under the porch light. The words were printed in bold, black letters, the message so simple yet so vile that she felt her grip tighten into a fist before she even realized she was clenching it. No place for old folks here. The chill that ran down her spine was not fear. It was something deeper, colder, a visceral understanding that this was not just about a pool or a fence or a sign on a gate. They wanted her gone. They wanted to erase her, to drive her out, to make her feel so unwelcome, so isolated, that she would give up and leave just to make their lives easier. They didn't want to share a neighborhood with someone like her, an elderly black woman who had dared to claim a space they thought was reserved for people like them. She inhaled slowly, forcing herself to exhale just as steadily, refusing to let them win, refusing to let them think they had shaken her. If they wanted her to feel small, they had chosen the wrong person. The next morning, she made a phone call. Then another. Then another. By noon, she was sitting across from a young journalist from a well-known digital news outlet, her hands folded neatly in her lap as the camera in front of her began recording. She didn't rant. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. She told her story with the kind of quiet, unwavering power that could not be ignored. She spoke of the repeated intrusions, the way her privacy had been violated time and time again while the police and neighborhood officials dismissed her complaints. She spoke of the racism and ageism that festered beneath the surface of so many so-called exclusive communities, of how they weaponized bureaucracy to target those who didn't fit their image. She spoke of the sign they had driven into her yard, the message it sent, the history it echoed, and she didn't have to say the words outright for people to understand exactly what was happening. This wasn't just about a pool. This was about power, control, exclusion, and the insidious ways communities pushed out the people they didn't want to see. When the interview was published the following evening, it spread like wildfire. First, local shares. Then regional. Then national. The comment sections exploded with outrage. This is modern-day segregation. How do these people sleep at night? They really thought they could bully an elderly black woman out of her own home and no one would notice? The hashtag Stand With Evelyn started trending, and within days, thousands of people, strangers from all over the country, were calling out the neighborhood, demanding action, demanding accountability, demanding justice. Evelyn's inbox flooded with messages of support, offers for legal assistance, letters from advocacy groups who had seen this story play out too many times before. Sandra Martin had wanted to humiliate her. The neighbors had wanted to intimidate her. Instead, they had just made her unstoppable. Evelyn Carter woke up to the sound of her phone vibrating endlessly against the wooden nightstand, the screen lighting up with an onslaught of messages, emails, and missed calls. The moment she unlocked it, the headlines flashed before her eyes. Authorities open investigation into suburban harassment case. Elderly woman speaks out against discrimination, sparks national outrage, elite neighborhood under scrutiny for racial and age-based exclusion. Her interview had done exactly what she hoped it would. The weight of public attention had forced those in power to pay attention, and now, for the first time since this war had begun, the pressure wasn't on her, it was on them. Before noon, a representative from the mayor's office had reached out, requesting a formal meeting to discuss the unfortunate circumstances that had led to what they called a community-wide misunderstanding. Evelyn nearly laughed at the choice of words, but she accepted the meeting, not because she believed in their sincerity, but because she wanted them to look her in the eye and acknowledge that she wasn't just some invisible nuisance they could dismiss. She arrived at the town hall dressed in her sharpest black blazer, her spine straight, her hands steady as she shook the mayor's hand and listened to him stumble through a carefully rehearsed speech about inclusion, respect, and their deep regret over how she had been treated. But the moment that truly struck her was when the chief of police stood up and, right there, in front of flashing cameras, offered her a formal apology. "We failed to act when you needed us," he admitted, his voice stilted but clear. "We dismissed your complaints. We didn't take your concerns seriously, and for that, we take full responsibility." Evelyn didn't blink. She didn't rush to comfort him, didn't let them off the hook with empty pleasantries. She let the silence sit heavy in the room, let them squirm under the weight of their own negligence before she finally responded. "I don't need your apology," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I need action." And she got it. Within 24 hours, a formal investigation into her neighbors was launched. Authorities began reviewing security footage, online threats, property damage reports, and the police negligence that allowed it all to escalate unchecked. Legal experts stepped in to assess potential charges: trespassing, harassment, destruction of private property, intimidation. Several names kept coming up in the reports, but none more than Sandra Martin. Evelyn wasted no time filing a civil lawsuit against Sandra and several others for emotional distress, vandalism, and targeted harassment. She documented everything: every broken lock, every trespass, every social media smear campaign, every passive-aggressive message, every incident that had turned her home into a battleground. She compiled it into a case so airtight that not even the best lawyers could argue their way out of it. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the community. The same people who had once mocked her, dismissed her, treated her as an outsider were now watching as their own reputations, their own property values, their own fragile sense of superiority crumbled under the weight of consequences. Sandra, once the self-proclaimed leader of the neighborhood, now found herself at the center of a legal and social nightmare she couldn't escape. The real blow came when her husband's company caught wind of the lawsuit. A senior executive at a high-profile firm, he had spent years crafting an image of prestige and social responsibility, an image that didn't align well with a wife under public scrutiny for racist intimidation and neighborhood harassment. By the end of the week, a for sale sign appeared on Sandra's front lawn. It was a quiet departure, no goodbye party, no sympathetic neighbors gathering to console her, just a moving truck and a woman who had finally run out of control, out of influence, out of allies. And Evelyn Carter? She stayed. The same people who had once ignored her, belittled her, and tried to push her out were now forced to sit across from her, waiting for her to speak. It had been 3 months since Sandra Martin left the neighborhood, 3 months since Evelyn won her lawsuit, reclaimed her home, and dismantled the power structure that had kept people like her in the shadows. But she hadn't stopped there. She hadn't just wanted revenge, she had wanted change. The Homeowners Association had always been controlled by the same clique of wealthy, entitled residents who made the rules to benefit themselves, who used their influence to push out anyone who didn't fit their perfect, curated image of what the neighborhood was supposed to be. That was over. Evelyn had stepped in and rewritten everything. With the backing of community activists, legal advisors, and thousands of supporters across the country, she had successfully established a new homeowners association, one that was no longer run by those who sought control, but by those who actually deserved protection. She straightened in her seat, her voice carrying through the room with quiet authority as she spoke. This community belongs to everyone who lives in it, not just the ones who think they should be in charge. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, though some faces remained tight with resentment, old grudges lingering beneath forced civility. Evelyn met each stare head-on, unshaken. They didn't have to like her, but they had no choice but to respect her. Under her leadership, new policies had been implemented, rules that ensured no resident would be harassed, no property would be targeted, no elder would be pushed out simply because they didn't fit in. Security measures had been strengthened, violations of private property carried serious consequences, and attempts to manipulate the system for personal gain were now met with swift legal action. The very people who had once weaponized bureaucracy against her were now trapped under its weight themselves. She saw it in the way they avoided her gaze when they passed her on the street, in the way they hesitated before speaking, measuring their words more carefully than before. The neighbors who had once gossiped about her, spread rumors, mocked her behind closed doors, were now the ones walking on eggshells. They had tried to make her feel like she didn't belong. Now they were the ones who felt unwelcome in their own game. For the first time since moving in, Evelyn walked through the neighborhood with a sense of absolute certainty. No more hushed whispers, no more veiled insults disguised as polite conversation, no more looks that suggested she was nothing more than an outsider overstaying her welcome. Those days were over. She was no longer a guest. She was the one in charge now. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of life moving on beyond the walls of Evelyn Carter's home. She sat in her backyard, a steaming cup of chamomile tea resting between her palms, her gaze drifting over the still, glassy surface of her perfectly untouched pool. The water reflected the deep indigo of the sky, a quiet mirror to the world around her, undisturbed, unclaimed by anyone but her. For the first time in months, there were no trespassers, no strangers lounging where they didn't belong, no entitled laughter echoing through her space as if it wasn't hers. Just peace. Her peace. She leaned back in her chair, allowing herself to take it all in, to feel the weight of what she had fought for settle over her, not as a burden, but as a victory. This was her place, her home, her sanctuary, and now, finally, there was no one left to challenge that. No one left to tell her she didn't belong. The neighborhood had changed. Not because they wanted it to, but because she had made it so. The ones who had tried to erase her had either left in disgrace or learned their lesson in silence. The ones who had underestimated her, who had tried to bully her, manipulate her, outlast her, they had lost. She had won. The quiet wrapped around her like a soft, protective blanket, the rhythmic chirping of crickets in the distance blending with the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. She had waited so long for this moment, had spent so many nights lying awake, listening for the sound of footsteps that didn't belong, for the laughter of those who had claimed her space as their own, for the threats disguised as warnings. And now? Nothing. Just the steady, unwavering silence of a woman who had refused to be pushed out. Then came the knock. A sharp, deliberate rap against her front door, breaking through the stillness like a stone tossed into calm water. Evelyn didn't startle, didn't tense, didn't even move right away. She just breathed. Slow, steady. She had been through too much, had faced far worse than an unexpected visitor in the night. The difference now? She wasn't afraid anymore. She set her tea down, rose to her feet with the patience of someone who had nothing to prove, and made her way inside, her steps unhurried, her pulse steady. The house was hers in a way it had never been before, not just a place she lived in, but a fortress she had built with her own defiance, her own resilience, her own unwavering refusal to be silenced. She reached the front door, resting her hand lightly on the knob, but didn't turn it right away. Whoever was on the other side, they would wait. They would wait because she decided they would. She took a deep breath, savoring the weight of this moment, the final reminder that she was no longer at anyone's mercy. They could knock. They could ask. They could want. But now, Evelyn Carter was the one who decided who got to come in.